Lucia, Doug, and I, to be hosting these Ashoka conversations and series on new leadership, because it has really become an exploration for us, a deep reflection on what this means for us and how that translates into our day-to-day activities and in how that enables us to accelerate the everyone a changemaker world we want to see. So just to give a little bit of a brief intro on Ashoka, we started working on system change 38 years ago when we started selecting Ashoka Fellows, who were people looking to create system solutions to tackle the root causes of big pressing social issues. And that we still continue doing that. And it really, we believe, is a key force that drives social transformation. But in addition, throughout the years, we also realized that in the historical moment that we find ourselves right now, we are also requiring to engage our work and engage our community in a mindset shifting, in which we call framework change. And for us, it's clear that change is happening faster than ever, that complexity is feeling denser than ever. And the inquiry for us is like, how do we lead in that context? How do we create and cultivate a world where everyone is a change maker, where children and youth can develop empathy and teamwork and new leadership and change-making skills? Who do we need to be, right? And how do we build those structures to enable these young people and ourselves to thrive and build a world that thrives? So we are in that inquiry. We've been listening to different thought leaders around the topic. And Otto, thank you for being here and sharing your insights with us. So far, we have seen some patterns around new leadership. And I'm going to name some that are quite important and that are generating a little bit of, or actually a lot of inquiry as to how do we do this? And so some of the patterns include our ability to grow our mind and be able to shift the way we're used to think and see the world, which also includes the capacity to hold different paradigms or different ways of thinking, including the definition of new leadership, by the way, and still be able to engage others into generative conversations that allows us to come to a collective doing. Another pattern we have observed is our capacity to see complex systems and work with emergence, and be able to navigate that like incertitude that arises. Another pattern is our capacity to get to know ourselves, identify the place from which we operate, from which we make decisions, we manage others, we get motivated, and ultimately is our drive to generate change in the world. Another pattern is our capacity to do personal work related to our bodies, our emotions, our traumas, and our thoughts. And also to our capacity to see the interdependence among different systems and how it comes down to our ability to see and understand relationships. Another pattern is our ability to work collectively in a way that is not transactional, but that is where we are able to create alignment around a shared intention globally, obviously. Hello. And the last pattern I will name right now is actually our ability to enable others to be in their power, to take action, to generate positive impact in the world. And so today we will learn other patterns and ways of being that can help this journey of accelerating a world where everyone is a change maker. And we're grateful that Otto is here, and we hope that you can talk with us about your journey and how you have been actually igniting really powerful collective awareness-based leadership in the work that you're doing with TheoryU and Presencing Institute and the renewal, the societal renewal and transformation work. So
yeah, so Otto, I'm going to introduce you very quick before you introduce yourself a little bit further with Lizette. Hi, everyone on the line. I'm Doug. I'm here with Lizette, co-host with Lucia of the Leadership Series. So Otto is both a practitioner and academic. He is senior lecturer at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a 1,000 Talents program professor at Tsinghua University, apologies for the pronunciation, Beijing. and co-founder of the Presencing Institute, which is championing a movement on societal renewal and transformation. He chairs the MIT Ideas program for cross-sector innovation as well. Otto is author of the book TheoryU, and he's co-author of the book Leading from the Emerging Future that outlines 8 acupuncture points for transforming capitalism. In 2015, he co-founded the MIT X U Lab, a massive open online course for leading profound change, in which more than 80,000 users from 185 countries have participated. It now has over 200,000 users. With his colleagues, he's delivered leadership development programs for corporate clients and co-facilitated innovation labs on reinventing education, health, business, government, and well-being. Otto has received many prizes, and in 2017, he was ranked #1 on the world's top 30 education professionals by globalgurus.org. So Otto, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it back to Lizette to host a conversation, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Okay, Otto. Well, really, the microphone is yours now. We would love to hear about your journey as a leading change making and the process that included helping give birth to TheoryU and Presencing Institute and ecosystem leadership and societal renewal. So it's a big topic. So I'll let you decide how you want to drive us into the conversation. Ideally, we would have time for questions and answers at the end. So let us just start. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Lucette, for the introduction and the invitation. And I also speak here on behalf of the whole kind of Presencing Institute community. So we are kind of thrilled to be, in a growing and deepening partnership with you all. And so we hope that this little talk and conversation that's starting today will continue and deepen in many ways that in part already have started in other places and in other cases may have happened going forward. Since what you described, Lucette, kind of with the patterns kind of that you summarized, so that's obviously exactly kind of the same things kind of we are dealing with. We try to make a positive impact on, and if we have learned, I think one of your questions, I loved your questions that came my way here yesterday or so, I saw them. One of them is, what is ecosystem leadership, right? And so, one definition of ecosystem leadership could be well, ecosystem leadership starts with, you can't do it alone, right? So no one can do it alone. And also, I think that's kind of really the starting point, and that's where you need to bring together, in order to have impact on the things you want to change, you need to bring together a very diverse group of people and players and networks and movements. And how to do that if in a situation where kind of hierarchy or like central control is not a coordination mechanism that's available. So how do you then build relationships and build platforms and build containers that allow us to catalyze collective action and change? That's really also the question that brings us to the table, and where we know kind of when we deepen our collaboration between the Ashoka world and kind of the networks that we have been engaged in, there's a great possibility moving forward. That's just kind of what I feel kind of from the first rounds of conversation. And so maybe taking your stories a little, your questions a little bit in an order. So maybe let me jump in a little bit with a few remarks on my own story as a change maker, right? So what is, as a change maker and leader, kind of that was the question you asked. And then I'm going to continue with a few things that we learned. So what is TheoryU, and what are some of the things that we have learned along the way, kind of in dealing with these some of these deeper issues. And we'll end then with your last question, which is kind of what is your own vision going forward. But please, kind of at any point, kind of please jump in midway. So I'm much more really interested in directing the conversation where you really are most interested in. So please kind of join in the navigation of this conversation. So a few points on my own story. So I'm living and operating for the past 2 decades here out of the Boston area. But I was born and raised in Europe. I actually grew up on a organic farm, a biodynamic farm, and that's probably the first context of relevance here, because I saw 60 years ago my parents moved from conventional farming to organic farming, and that, of course, moves you from like being part of the community of farmers and so on to being ostracized, basically, because you try to do something radical new that, if successful, puts everyone else a little bit in a more difficult light, because why are they using pesticides and so on. So much of my thinking is really thanked to that context. And the way I think about social change is a lot inspired really by seeing organic agriculture. And at the end of the day, so I think we all do the same work, which is, what I saw my parents doing is, as an organic farmer, what's the one thing, the one kind of capital that you have? It's the quality of the soil, right? You can't use pesticides, you can't use other chemical ways, fertilizers. But what you always try to do is to improve the quality of the soil. And so there's like an invisible condition that allows that what's visible, what's growing above the surface, to really flourish. And I think in social change, it's exactly the same thing. So the social soil really is the invisible part of the social field, is the quality of relationships that we have with each other. And a lot of what we do as change makers is kind of create these conditions that improve the quality of the relationship then, in order to accomplish the practical results that we all care about. So that was a first context. The second one is I woke up more kind of in terms of society and change during the late 1970s and the green movements. I became part in Germany of the anti-nuke and the green movement back then in Germany. Close to our farm was one of the main battlefields of the anti-nuke movement back then. And I remember a day kind of when we returned with 100,000 people in illegal demonstration, and then everyone was attacked by the police and a lot of violence. Basically, I left the day. So I had an experience where, even though I wasn't hurt physically, kind of, I remember this situation kind of where the police force came in. It was too late for the crowd to run away, and everyone moved into stillness. And then they with their batons kind of cut into our group and hurt people. But then, because no one was fighting back, they stopped and turned away. And kind of this, that for me personally was one of the first occasions where I felt, because I physically could feel the pain, even so I, in my soul, could feel the collective pain, the pain inflicted to the collective group, even though physically I was not harmed. So that was one of the first times where I really felt the power of a social field, the field of a collective group that has its own boundaries, kind of its own way. And when I came back that day, so I was, even though kind of I wasn't physically harmed, I was no longer the same person, and I, sort of knew what I would do with the rest of my life. So it's like interesting that seeing something and feeling something, even though it's just a short moment, is activating a deeper intention within you that keeps being, even though you deviate every now and then, but that keeps being like a direction that I have been following since. So that was a little bit kind of the green movement, the anti-nuke movement in Germany. And then back a few years later, so there was another moment kind of where I saw something really that changed something within me. I went to Free University Berlin, and then was really disappointed by the quality of learning and everything basically there. But there was one professor that really inspired me. So his name was, it's the peace researcher Johann Galtung, and he is the author of the Theory of Structural Violence. And he was a visiting faculty there. And so he really used science as an action researcher, kind of science as a way of not only describing society as is, but as a way of making society a better place, and inquiring into, what does it take to really shift our quality of relationships, so we reduce the amount of structural violence, for example, in the world. It was like so you're in a place where everything is basically wrong, right? Nothing is living up to your expectations, but you see one person operating from a very different place, and that's enough to switch on a light within you that never, when you're lucky, never dies. And I thought that was also really interesting to me. I think it was kind of seeing this man, and then of course I was connected to the peace movement and the civil rights movement in East Germany, Eastern Europe. I then connected to him and organized events in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Berlin and West Berlin, and later on brought him to university. So he became a mentor to me and ended up also being my PhD advisor. But it was really kind of that moment of seeing him, or one person, using something very traditional operating from a very different place, that activated an aspiration within me. So I realized that a lot of the things we fought against back then, in terms of the peace movement and green movement, really was just symptoms, right? And everything, when you go to the deeper root issues of all these issues and topics and problems, it all deals with the same thing. It's basically the economy, right? So it's the economy and the way political decision making is happening with special interest groups and so forth. So realizing that, I chose to study economics and management, and that's and then from there, so I was lucky. I entered a small university where you really had student-centric way of learning. So basically, students were empowered to develop their own initiative. And so since now, I will come to that later on in terms of my own dream, but it really, so this experience that you are as a young person in a place where somebody is trusting you. In this case, it was the dean, kind of, so they just had like a student-centric concept of learning, and they 100% trusted the students that they selected. So I just know that this experience of as a young person being in a place where your initiatives and your capabilities to pull off something is there's somebody kind of who's believing in that. It makes all the difference in the world. So for example, in our case, we ended up organizing as students a global peace university for 35 students from 12 countries. For 1 year, we went around the world. So there's a lot, there's no limit of what we can do when you put together young people and give them some minimal resources and trust. The trust that you already have all these things within you. So I experienced that. And that certainly, and I also experienced there the principle that 5 people can change the world. So that really kind of when you bring together a group around an intention, that, there is, this is kind of activating a collective force that attracts possibilities, attracts partners, attracts helping hands. So it's almost like a switching on thing. So connecting with your deeper life's intention, and then kind of bringing together people around that. So activating the power of intention is something that I very intensely experienced as a young person, and then began to also study in terms of other cases later on in my research. And the last thing I want to say, so when I basically, long story short, I did my PhD thesis on something, no one ever read this, but the title was Reflective Modernization of Capitalism as Revolution from Within. So don't worry, no one ever read this thing. But the point was, if you really want to transform capitalism, you need to, not only shift outer conditions, but also inner conditions. That was the point. But what I was realizing, that I was just kind of another person kind of making blah, 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 right? Kind of writing big books or, statements or, talking about something that I couldn't do myself, really. And that's what brought me to MIT, because I wanted to learn how to become an action researcher, how to actually not only talk about a new economy, but develop methods and tools that help the change makers in the field to actually make that happen. So that was really the whole thing, why I came here and why I still haven't managed to move on. So I'm still here and I'm still on that journey, right? So to develop these methods and tools and make them available. And so if I had to pinpoint just kind of one moment where I felt, it was at least for me a moment of significance, even though from the outside really nothing much happened at all. 2003 or so, it was kind of the first year, 2003 or 4, I don't quite remember. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, kind of, she had spent like a decade or two with Francesco Varela and some, cognition and brain researchers in dialogues, kind of meditation, mindfulness, and how it connects with brain science and kind of neuroscience. And that was the first year they put this dialogue out into the open in all the experiments that they have been doing. So it was fascinating. MIT was the place. It was like 2 days kind of where all these neuroscientists and, meditators kind of, it was really kind of the interface of two things, right? Science and neuroscience on the one hand, and spirituality or mindfulness or consciousness on the other hand, okay? So that was really inspiring to me. And so I was listening to that for 2 straight days, and I also felt that there was something missing, because these two, science and spirituality alone, so what's the point? Because I thought that the third point that was missing in that triangle was societal transformation. And then, so coming out of that, experiencing the power of science and spirituality on the one hand, and the lack of societal transformation really made me aware of what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, which is creating a place that really investigates this triangle: science, spirituality or consciousness, and societal transformation. Kind of so what's the interconnection, and how can we be more methodical and more precise in developing methods and tools that really help us to not only create outer but also inner conditions for true transformation in society. So that was, sometimes, right, you have this kind of, you have a moment of total clarity, then, sometimes before you lose it, right? So I had this moment then, and it hasn't really fully left ever since. So that's a little bit my journey to this place. And I thought I show you just kind of for the other big question. So that's kind of the story. And then the other big question you really asked, Lucette, is, the key insights. What is TheoryU and some of the key insights? So let me I want to just get at that with a few pictures. And then we can jump into the conversation. So I don't know, can you see the picture okay?
Perfect, thank you.
So this is from my colleague and friend Kelvie Bird. So many of the pictures, various of the pictures are coming from her, or images kind of like this one. And it is depicting disruption. So if you put yourself on the left-hand side, right, current reality, and then on the right-hand side, we have like emerging future. we know quite a bit about current reality. We know a little less about this, but we know least about how to move from here to there. And the present thing, so our TheoryU takes a perspective on that, which says, you know what? The journey from here to there is not only an outer journey, it's an inner journey as well. And the gateway of kind of moving from here to there has to do with reverting your, so kind of has to do with accessing your deeper sources of knowing, right? Moving from downloading old patterns to seeing with fresh eyes, to sensing where in your current reality you already feel the seeds of the future, and then kind of through this letting go and letting come, moving there. So the perspective we take from a TheoryU point of view on this problem here, on this challenge, is that in order so that when we really connect to the current moment, the experience of the current moment, that a part of our experience of the current moment is already operating from the emerging future. So in other words, the seeds of tomorrow are already here. But in order to access them, we have to connect with the deeper levels of our own experience. And that has to do with this sensing and presencing kind of thing. So that's in a nutshell. So what TheoryU is. How TheoryU is a method that deals with this type of problem, the problem of disruption. And the problem of disruption means the future is going to be different from the past. So doing more of the same is not an option. So taking a few more small steps here is not an option. Then what do we do? So that's the question. And so when we look around, so disruption happens all over, as you know. I'm not saying anything new. And when you look around, we see three ways of responding to disruption. The first one is downloading more of the same. The second one is turning back to the past. And the third one is leaning into the emerging future. Turning back to the past is basically a freeze reaction, freezing the mind, the heart, the will, or closing it, aka amplifying ignorance, hate, and fear. Moving into the emerging future, or leaning into the emerging future, requires us to open the mind, the heart, the will, aka curiosity, cultivating curiosity, compassion, courage. So, but we see a lot of this denial, desensing, absencing, blaming others, destruction, self-destruction. I mean, that's usually the main part of the talk. We all know that, right? So I don't need to comment on that. So that's the world we live in. We have these different reactions. And if you ask me, so why is it that over the past 2 or so years, we have seen an enormous amplification of the blue stuff, the upper half? Why is that? And well, there's a number of factors, but one is it's, you know, we only have like a decade left for dealing with the climate crisis. And so there's a higher sense of urgency. And then another factor is technology, right? The role of Facebook and undermining democracy.
Ja, ik ben nu net even een online cursus aan het volgen. Heb je daar geen last van? Nee, echt niet? Oh, oké.
Ik hoorde het trouwens. Ik hoorde wel vaak een geluid, maar... Can you please mute? Thank you.
So the amplification of the upper part, you know, has a lot to do with social media. Has a lot to do with the role that big data and Silicon Valley-based companies have been playing, and the shift of kind of the normal mode of capitalism to surveillance capitalism that we are observing these days. That's a whole other talk, but I just want to mention that so that there is something happening here that deserves our attention. And that if we talk about systems change, really we need to wrap our mind around, because we can't just say, oh, that's not our business. We just deal with the lower half of this spectrum here. But, you know, in a way you can say, so why is it we see, you know, a lot of this blue stuff going on today in the world, that, you know, the Trumpism, you know, not only in America, but in many other places as well. And the answer is the blue stuff is basically the result of a massive educational failure, right? Because the blue cycle, the cycle of destruction and self-destruction, amplifying ignorance, hate, and fear, is basically a freeze reaction to the mind when you deal with disruption. So it's the result of two factors. One, you have disruption. Two, you don't have the sufficiently and required amount of capacity to open the mind, heart, and will. Because that's hard. If you face disruption, it's hard to do, to lean into that with an open mind, open heart, open will. That's a capacity you need to build. That's why in societies we have this thing called institutions of education, and we have this thing called leadership capacity building. What do we do with these two things? Not many good things, right? So we are not really building this capacity, but that's why we have them, in my view. And that's kind of where we come together. If we want to really talk about systemic change, we need to address some of these deeper root issues which has to do with building capacity, not only individually, but also collectively on this lower level, because otherwise the disruption that's coming our way, and we only know the disruption is going to increase. It's already too late to prevent that. So disruption will go up. So where's our leverage point? Our leverage point is building the capacity for this third response, for leaning in, for kind of opening the mind, the heart, the will. All right, that brings us to systems thinking, because and that's kind of the first learning point, you could say, you said to your question. So that's why I came here, right? Because I wanted to learn systems thinking, because if we don't apply a method there, then kind of we are just being super active in the dark, right? Kind of super activism, but with not a lot of understanding. So, and what is systems thinking? Systems thinking starts with this, what you see here, which is the distinction between symptoms and root issues. Well, that's kind of basically what systems thinking is, right? So as a systems thinker, you try to not just react against the symptoms, but you try to understand and address the deeper root issues. And what you see here is basically an evolution. The three levels of root issues, structures, thought, or mental models, mindsets, and source, are really kind of three, it's the evolution of systems thinking in a nutshell, you could say. Of course, kind of, we need to understand the disconnects of systemic structures below the surface, but often underneath we have it to do with mindsets and, you know, and paradigms of thought that give rise to these structural disconnects. And then beneath these mindsets, you know, is something that here I call source. It's the sources of self. It's the sources of our identity, the sources of our energy and our creativity. You know, but instead of source, I also could have written awareness or consciousness, right? Because consciousness really is about kind of the deeper sources of our creativity, of our will, and of our energy. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of in terms of a method that we try to, so what gives you, what I think today is awareness-based systems change. So awareness-based systems change is looking at systems not only from the first 2 or 3 levels, but from the perspective of all 4 of these levels. All right, so then engaging, so let's now move into, so that's kind of basically the preface, right? But then what does it take to really move down this U process, kind of from symptoms, structures, thought to source? So the left-hand side. So that's really the main question in applied situations. So the first thing that we learned there is this: you need a process for that. And the main point about the process is, so when you take a group through that, for example, and the main point of the process is doing this: moving beyond the downloading, moving people beyond downloading kind of the past patterns of thought, the past patterns of behavior. And from a big picture view, kind of this process looks like this: observe, 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 retreat and reflect, allow the inner knowing to emerge, act in an instant. Kind of that's kind of the whole world of design thinking and prototyping. But you know, you really start with getting out of your own bubble and move into the observe, observe, observe. So moving through this, so that you need a process, that more or less kind of is, here on this side, bringing you to the edges of the system, right? Seeing the system from the margins, kind of from the perspective of people who are most, who are on the receiving end of structural violence, right? Let's put it that way. And institutional racism and so forth. And then kind of connecting to the deeper sources of knowing, kind of moving into a place of deep reflection, stillness. And from there, generating ideas that are explored by doing. All right. For this process to work, that was the second thing that we learned. You need to engage, particularly when you do that in multi-stakeholder situations, you need to engage in some inner leadership work or inner development work that today I would summarize with these three terms: open mind, open heart, open will. So what do we mean with open mind? It's the capacity to suspend old habits of thought and to see with fresh eyes. What do we mean with open heart? It's the capacity to redirect, to look at a problem not from your own angle, but from the viewpoint of someone else. And then to, connect more to the whole field of perspectives that you're operating in. Well, what do you mean by open will? It's the capacity of letting go of the old and letting come of the new. Why is that so difficult, right? Opening the mind, the heart, the will. It looks like easy. So what's the big problem with that? Well, it is a challenge because of these three things: voice of judgment, voice of cynicism, voice of fear. And that's really why we have, this thing called leadership or facilitation, right? Or kind of the art of really helping a group. Because, what do you do as a facilitator? Kind of you help people, teams, to suspend the voice of judgment. Because if you don't do that, you cannot access the power, the creative power of the open mind. And this is the same thing, right? So if, opening the heart, activating compassion and empathy, that's a problem sometimes, because it makes you, puts you out into a place of vulnerability. So what's the easy way out? Voice of cynicism, right? By which I mean all emotions of distancing, basically. And then probably this doesn't really need a lot of comments, right? So voice of fear is very, very evident, and it's a very, so I'm not giving obviously you any easy answers. I'm just showing you the map of what we are dealing with in any kind of situation of change today, what you are dealing with. And as an American, I would say kind of these are the three enemies, right? Voice of judgment, voice of cynicism, voice of fear. As a European, I would say these are the three inner sources of resistance, right? So they are like they're forces that we meet outside of ourselves, but also inside of ourselves, and that's of course where the leverage is. And 50% of dealing with them deals with noticing them. All right, so that's the second learning, right? So we need to engage in this inner leadership work, and we need some methods and tools there that help us to do so. What does that look like now in practice? So when you take a group through this process, it's a little bit like that. So what you see here, so we basically, all the labs and stuff, capacity building, but also innovation labs and multi-stakeholder, they all basically use the same structure. And it's this structure you see here. So these 5 things here. So the lower 3 is what I already explained to you. Co-sense is the observe from the edges of the system, deep reflection. And this is kind of the design thinking, learning by doing, developing the prototypes. But then in any kind of real project, of course, you have a whole thing going up front, which is about bringing all the key stakeholders together and, clarifying, uncovering with them a shared intention, right? That's the co-initiation here. And then from there, you move into the lab, you walk into the shoes of the most marginalized, deep reflection, generate idea, explore them. And then the last one is really integrating all the key insights from the local prototypes and then take the best of these things and bring that into the system, scale that throughout the system one way or another. So what happens in such a process, that often can take over years. Sometimes it's like 9 to 12 months. Often it's, you start here. So this already can take a year or 2 when you really count from the very beginning, right? But then when you start here, this is usually often done like in 9 months or so. That can be also much faster. But the more complex, the more multi-diverse the grouping is, the more time that tends to take, also the upfront time. And then from here, so the co-evolve can also then have multiple iterations. But what happens throughout this process, other than tangible outcomes and results, there's a mindset shift going on from this way of seeing reality and the system to this way of seeing the system. So here, the system is something out there, and here, I am part of the system. So the shift from here to here, if it happens on the level of the individual, is called mindfulness, right? I'm sure you have heard about mindfulness. It's one of the big things going on in the last 10 years, right, in leadership. So mindfulness is the capacity of paying attention to your attention, noticing how you pay attention. And when you see this shift in a group, people talk about reality, about the system like this, and then they move to talking about the system like this. What do we call that? It's a shift from debate to dialogue. Dialogue is not people talking with each other. Dialogue is the capacity of a system to see itself, right? Which is this thing, the shift from here to here. So in a way, let's just forget all the terms that I use and let's just boil everything down. I, as a systems change guy, right? When I work with groups, with organizations, with labs, with multi-stakeholder groups, what is, at the end of the day, how is it that I create value, right? What's my main contribution? It is this. It's helping people to move from this perspective on the issue to this one. And you cannot do that by talking about that, but you have to use tools. So I want to show you a few examples, because this is the shift from a silo perspective or ecosystem awareness to an ecosystem, to a system view or an ecosystem perspective, because you begin to see your own role through the view of all the other stakeholders. So that's really the shift in consciousness that makes all the difference in any kind of multi-stakeholder process. And I want to show you, hone in on this specific aspect and show you a few pictures when and where that happens. Because that's kind of where ultimately kind of success or failure in such a lab process originates, in my view. So I want to mention like 3 or 4 tools, as some of which I'm sure will be very familiar to you already. So this first tool is sensing journeys. And that's basically, so this is the top 30 people of the biggest fintech in the world. So it's a technology and a financial organization. It's the name is Ant Financial. they have, among others, succeeded in making 230 million of their Chinese customers participating in reforestation activities. So they are a huge change maker as well. But in this case, they said, look, our problem is this. We have the smartest people around in our leadership team. They're all terrific. And they do a terrific job in their own area of responsibility. But as a team, our collective IQ is not very high. So we are not kind of really pulling our full weight there. Can you help us with that? So what we picked a topic. The topic was globalization. And then rather than talking about how we work as a team and so on, they spent half a week in conducting learning journeys in 2 countries in Southeast Asia. So this is the top leadership team. Almost all of them are Chinese. I think like 100% almost, yeah, 95%. So basically, they are heavily biased to their Chinese perspective. So they talk about globalization, but they don't really feel it, right? So what it looks and feels like from the perspective of others. So we took half a week, split the group up into country groups, and then in groups of 3 or 4, map the entire business ecosystem, all the way from government to the communities, the customers of the customers, and so on, and put them on an empathy journey, right? So where they basically had meetings with all these people. We trained them a little bit in deep listening and dialogue, and really connecting to someone else's experience, not just hearing to the words, but connecting to the experience someone else has. And they spent 3 days really in deep immersion, really kind of empathizing with all the different perspectives they have in their entire business ecosystem. Then they came together as a whole group in Singapore, shared everything that they learned within a variety of methods. And you can see that they had totally changed not only their topic of their perspective on globalization, but also the perspective they play themselves in the larger ecosystem. Because they had a visceral, embodied experience of what it looks like, feels like, from the viewpoint of the much more marginalized participants in their ecosystem. "3D mapping." So this is a different place. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative on sustainable food, Sao Paulo, dealing with some of these so-called food deserts there, and 30 different organizations participating, 150 people in this case. So the method that you see here is something we call 3D mapping. You build a physical model of the current system. Then you reflect from that with structured questions, and then you change it to the future that you want to see. And you again reflect on that. So it is an embodied process. So you build this thing, you reflect that, you listen to all the other perspectives, and then you begin to change the model that it better represents all the perspectives that you heard. So again, it is, it's a moment in a workshop where you can really see the shift from silo to systems view, shift from looking at the system just from my angle to in an embodied way, in a felt way, to really integrating all the other perspectives, particularly the ones of the most marginalized players. Same method, different place, Indonesia. That's the third method here. It's called 4D mapping. I don't know, some of you may be familiar with what is it called? Constellation work. So this is a blend between mindfulness, social science mapping, and constellation work. So basically, what you see here, you build the system with objects, and here you do the same thing. You build the system, all the different stakeholders, but instead of objects, you take your own body. So each person is representing one of the key roles in the system. But we always include, so for example, this guy is, he's a banker in his real life, but his role is Mother Earth. So you want to bring in the ecological divide, the social divide, the most marginalized groups, and then also the spiritual divide in terms of the highest future potential. So that's, it's another method. I can only say, so, I mean, a picture doesn't really show you a lot, but what is it that I learned? I have done that so often, and I just know. I mean, this thing, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? But if you do one of these things, it's worth at least 1,000 pictures, because it creates a collective seeing capacity. The entire system begins to see and wrap their mind around some of the deeper structural issues in the system, where structural violence happens, who is excluded, who is not seen. What are some of the deeper dynamics that are getting into our way? It not only creates a shared perception of that, but it also creates a language that allows you as a team then to address some of these deeper issues and create prototype initiatives around that. Same method, different context with entrepreneurs in China, the CEO owners of a number of companies there. And then a fourth method that you're certainly familiar with, scenario planning, you can use in a similar way, right? So you just kind of deepen the sensing capacity, the learning journeys. And so I could, and that's another tool that's very applicable kind of for this more collective embodied learning methods that I gave you some examples of. Silence, right? Silence in nature, one of the simplest and most powerful interventions you can have. You put a group for a half day out in nature with a good process, a good preparation kind of into a solo silence experience. And you will be amazed how the group is coming back. And, the same group is no longer the same group when you at the end of that day kind of have a sharing. And kind of, so it's another very reliable intervention, how you can shift the inner place from which people are operating, which is particularly relevant when you have diverse conflicting stakeholder groups, where one institution, where you have built-in institutional conflict already. So when you have that, you need on a personal level kind of to create a deeper holding space so that people can really deal with these social and institutional complexities from a different place. We do that, among others, also in the UN, kind of with the SDG labs. And that's another example where, so this is a little toned down. So the UN, not necessarily we do this solo in nature thing and stuff, but it's a toned down version. But because it's so conventional, the environment, it still works. Because if you create a good holding space among people that need to work together in order to have the collective impact they want, a lot is possible in a relatively small amount of time. Another thing that we learned is you can bring these processes, kind of transformational change, to scale. But in order to do that, because at the end of the day, yes, we all have seen these stories of transformation change, but can we bring it to scale, to the scale that's necessary today? And so we learned a bunch of things about that. And we learned that you need to really radically, so that you can have a blended online to offline learning infrastructures, and that the capacity and the willingness to self-organize locally today in the world is much bigger than anyone would expect. So we have, with ULab, for example, have had in the past 4 years more than 1,200 hubs. Not all of them are still active, so there are a few hundred still active, but so there is it's very significant numbers. Each hub is place-based. It's kind of a real community that's coming together for 4 months going through this process. So there's real stuff happening there. And that's really what started as an online course, and which really resulted into an ecosystem of profound societal innovation that we now try to co-evolve with. And one of the forms to do that, and Ashoka, some of the Ashoka teams are participating here, is in really creating a community of teams that kind of go through this process in 4 months and that coach and help each other around certain impact areas to use some of these tools that I just described in a way that helps them to bring in all the various ecosystem partners that they need to engage in order to have the impact they want. Wrapping up, so let's just step back here and say, okay, what's really, I started with this farm image, right, the field. And when you really look at the what we try, so the way how we try to bring about change, it can be summarized with this social field image here, which is that the quality of the inner conditions and the quality of the soil, that which is the so that we develop like in a social system, co-shapes the quality of relationships that we have among people and organizations and groups, which gives rise to patterns of thinking and organizing, conversing and organizing, which then creates practical results. So what we are interested in, is of course the practical results. But what I'm basically saying is what we learned over the years is that the real impact is when you work here. So it's kind of how to build these inner and outer container conditions, the holding spaces. That's what we learned kind of when you do that really well, there's a lot that over a long time is flowing upwards here. And if this is broken down here, you can be very busy up here, but you're often not very happy about or satisfied about the results that emerge from that. On the vision, so the vision is basically how we can cultivating these principles. So and it's how to build really a global university of societal, that isn't, taking place in campuses, but that is a university that is organized around all the societal transformation initiatives that you and we and others are involved in, and where really the key principle is not, so learning is not to filling a barrel, but is lighting a flame. And I gave a few examples of that, and you all have your own example. And where the main focus is on action learning, that involves the whole person, head, heart, and hand, that involves the whole system, right, all the different sectors, that is grounded in self-knowledge, because in the chaotic world we are in, that's the only thing you can rely on. And that's kind of the foundation based on which you can have impact in the world. That, of course, is using systems thinking. And what do we mean by that? Is making a system see itself. And system sensing, right? So using social art practices in the way I indicated, that allows us to activate embodied ways of learning. The 3D, the 4D as examples for that. That is based on a method that develops a variety of methods and tools, kind of that, can, make us better and better in delivering these kinds of new learning environments. And then lastly, that is democratizing the access to this deep learning cycle by developing the infrastructures for that at scale. And that is activating kind of, what could be called kind of a fourth teacher, which is kind of a generative social fields. Because at the end of the day, I think what we talk about with all the above is that we transform toxic social fields, which is what prompted my parents to move away from the old agriculture, and which is what we see today in the blues, the hate, ignorance, and fear part of the cycle. That's kind of the toxic social field that we all are part of today. And what we try to do is really to, by building the capacity for opening the mind, the heart, the will, to build the capacity for generative social field, as indicated here. So that's, when you ask me what's the vision, that's kind of what we try to do. We try to build these infrastructures. I think the people are there, the methods are there, and to have the impact, we need a global movement in the world right now, and the global movement needs a place where you can cultivate the deeper capacities, and that's where we try to make a contribution, and where we are looking for partners to make that contribution together on.
Thank you, Otto. This has been really powerful. Thanks for sharing with us. We would like to have some questions. Is that okay with you? We have a number of questions, and we could read them all, and then you answer, or we can go one by one. What would be your preference?
Whatever. You can, if there are some groups of questions, you can take them together, but it's your choice. I'm open. Either way is fine. Okay.
So I think I prefer to read them, and then we'll go. You'll respond according to your radar. All right. Lucia, would you like to share the questions?
Yes, sure. Happy to do so. So I'll start with a question from Marie Ringler, who is, I guess, joining us from Europe. And she's asking, we always think that these co-iterations need a strong backbone organization. For example, at Ashoka, Ashoka, how do you see that? How is it done on an organizational level? Do you also think that it can only have impact if a strong backbone organization is behind it?
You can read the other ones, Lucia.
Okay, got it. So then we also have a question from Ross, who's saying, we've spotted the pattern of weaving as a style of leadership that is essentially about bringing people through this kind of ULAB process. To what extent do you think it is important to build the capacity of weavers in order to maximize the number of people who are having these experiences? And do these experiences work better when the group shares a focus on transforming a specific place versus a global theme? Then we also have a question from Adam, who says, one of the biggest forces for social transformation I am aware of has been self-organization. For example, the Arab Spring, where millions of people self-organizing as a single entity. Self-organization usually requires a negative, shocking event to occur to catalyze and activate the masses. How might self-organization be stimulated or occur with a positive catalyst? Are there any examples? And then we also have a question from Valeria, who's saying, an increasing number of Ashoka Fellows have embedded in their strategies a mindset change experience that is foundational to their work and their way of engaging others. How could we help to build their capacity and that of their partners to design mindset change experiences that help to see systems with a new perspective?
So the last one, so that's what's that, monthly or mindset change? So that's
mindset change experience.
So that's a group within Ashoka?
So this is referring to what Ashoka Fellows many Ashoka Fellows have been doing within their strategies of incorporating these mindset change experiences.
Okay. All right, got it.
And then we have an addition, actually, from another colleague to this question from Valeria, who is saying, to entice people into transformative experiences like 4D, we need accessible language that does not deliver blank looks. Creating the container for social soil is one nice analogy that I get. Seeing ourselves in the system through mindfulness is another. Might we co-create a library of mindset shift stories questions, and analogies that can be adapted to audiences based on listening and intentions.
Wonderful. So I'm at capacity. So let me jump in here.
Please do.
I love that. So I think the library, that's fantastic. So I love that. And I think it's also, that's a point well taken. We need a very accessible language. And that also means you need at times different languages for different audiences, right? We need to be multilingual, kind of, that was one of Lucetta's early points. And so building this library together, I think is a great example. And also, you know, I know that very well. So when you bring people to do these kind of weird kind of practices, you need a story or two to just kind of bring in the legitimacy of that, so that you can navigate the resistance a little bit, because you know, there is a little bit you have to jump over, and also you have to. I often find it useful to say, hey, you all know where kind of, you know, so when you can like draw kind of a little kind of circle, or like quasi-circle, say that's kind of the edge of your comfort zone, and then if you, as long as you stay inside the edge, no significant leadership learning is going to happen, right? So all what we know from decades of the capacity building, significant leadership learning happens when you stretch the comfort zone. You don't want to overstretch it, you don't want to break it, but if you stay inside, nothing significant is happening for you. So also inviting, so creating an environment that, you know, is actually inviting people to take a risk, or inviting people, because if you want to stimulate kind of the curiosity and compassion and courage, so we need to, you know, begin, also create a context for that. So it's, yes, we need the story, the language, but also we need to create the context and the environment for us that actually makes that a positive thing. And that makes the not knowing a positive thing. So there is a, and I really resonated, Lucette, with your early remark at the opening, where you said, hey, so it's kind of, we are dealing with different mindsets. And here's the reality. Yes, you can, you know, talk about new leadership until the cows come home, but the reality is half of our organization are still working the old ways. So the reality is that many of us actually are living today in two worlds. One is the new leadership world that that we just talked about, and it's the key focus of this series that you have. But the other reality is that the old world is still there, and you also need to perform and operate in the context of that. That's true for most people today. So it's not only like one is the espoused reality, the other one is how it really is. No, it's really both of those things are true at times. So what it means is, for you, you need to be multilingual. You need to be able to operate one way in one situation, in another way in another. And so that's and in that regard, kind of this library and the language there, that could be very good. So let me briefly also talk about the others. Strong backbone organization. Yes, I would say in general, so when you deal with ecosystem, which means projects that involves significantly different stakeholders, right? So when you deal with a real multi-stakeholder situation, you need so then you bring together leaders that basically have different top commitment priorities, right? Because usually the institutions are not aligned. So in their own objectives and targets, kind of what you do is not number 1, 2, or 3. So, and that means there's always positive energy. Yes, let's do that, and then no follow through. I mean, we all know that situation. So you need an enabling organization to get, so to avoid kind of these kinds of shortcomings. So some kind of secretariat, or type of backbone. I'm not sure how strong it needs to be. It also sometimes it's one of the participating institutions kind of who plays that role, or kind of it's a combined effort. It can be also distributed, but we know without this focused effort and support, it's very hard, because it's already hard. And there's too much noise, too much competing commitments that everyone has. So the more multi-stakeholder and multi-sector, the more you need two things, actually. So backbone organization, yes, and a platform, right? So for this cross organizational collaboration, yes, you need that. But what you also need, that's the other thing, is a container. So the platform is the tangible part. The container is the invisible part, and that's often what's missed. So the container is the trust we have. What we do as a group that allows us to really access the deeper levels of listening, move from a debate more to a dialogue kind of conversation. And that's something you need to build, right? It's something you need to put your attention on, even though it's intangible. So that's what I would say there. Yes, backbone plus. Weaving as a style of leadership, build capacity of, absolutely. So I think what we learned is also, this going to scale, right? And decentralizing these types of environment. We learned that the quality, and I think kind of the way I understood your weaving here is, so you need, in order to build these capacity in teams or in ecosystems, in places, you need to, so the quality of what happens in these teams is a function of the holding capacity within the weavers, right? Within the core teams there. So that's really where you want to invest in. So you want to really invest into a number of people who are deepening these capacities, and then they, being connected with each other in this weaver network, they can build this capacity in their local teams. And I completely agree that it should be, the focus, of course, needs to be on local things that really matter there, rather than, abstract global things, for all the obvious reasons, right? So I completely agree with what was suggested. Self-organization requires a negative, shocking event, Arab Spring. Well, so I think there's like a different ways of making sense of the Arab Spring, but so when you look at it from a social media, so I think kind of the social media as a platform for self-organizing has made it more easy to break things than to make things, right? So there is, I think, these deeper, yes, there was a good mobilization early on, but then building these deeper capacities that we talk about here, that you talk about, that requires a different infrastructure, also a different digital infrastructure. And that's the big criticism of Facebook and social media, because in the end, technology is neither good nor bad. Technology is a function of the intention that you put underneath. And when you design a technology that is built around empire building and profit maximization, well, then you have all sorts of toxic, and when hate and anger is driving your engagement, which means driving your revenues, well, then that's what, how you undermine democracy and create a toxic climate in societies. That's what's happening now. But if the intention would be something different, such as time well spent, and so forth, kind of really kind of more the quality and well-being of the whole, then that you design different technologies and different infrastructures. And I think that's where we need to experiment with, and that's where I would say ULab is an example, right? It's a large-scale example that shows that technology can be used with a different intention, but it needs to be complemented with social technologies. Social technologies, at the end of the day, are methods and tools that help us to access better the open mind, open heart, open will. both individually and collectively. So I gave you a few examples, but that's at the end of the day, if you just throw digital technologies, the apps and stuff into, and then usually what happens pretty much stays at the surface. I think the art of building a global movement, the art of really activating the deeper essence of our humanity, has to do with awareness-based social technologies that need to be developed and cultivated and practiced and made available. And so it's a much more complex, it's not just kind of, oh yeah, this one app, and then we push it out and that's happening. It's a much more complex. It has everything to do with a holding space, with building the container, and with cultivating the deeper condition that we operate from. And that's, call it weavers, call it something else. But that's really where I think you're exactly moving in the right direction. Investing, focusing on that, and investing in these deeper conditions, which then will have a much deeper and positive impact longer term. Because that's the one thing I learned. You really invest in that, you build that, and you will be amazed what happens. Not instantly, it happens with a delay, but what happens kind of 3, 5, 10 years after. So I don't buy this negative shock. I mean, I do agree it is often sparked by that, but I think the biggest untold story in the world today is there is a dormant positive potential that's kind of in the world already, and that we both, you guys and we, are tapping into. And there's much more of that. And kind of that's what there's a lot more potential in the world than what we have catalyzed. And that's missing, I think. That negative shock is not missing. They keep coming. But what's missing is us catalyzing the positive potential that gets crowded out by all the noise. Then the last question here, the mindset. Well, basically, I would say, I mean, that's, of course, that's a kind of general question because it refers to many. I would say on the mindset change, in a way, it boils down to something really simple. And so mindset change, no one can do alone. No one can do by looking into the device, right, the screen. You need a social holding space. The conditions. So there's like 2 or 3 conditions that you need. One is practice. The basic currency for mindset change is practice. It's not ideas you buy into. Ideas are cheap. Anyone can have an idea. You can download it from the web. So it's not ideas, it's practice. What's a practice? It's stuff you do every day, like kind of a moment of stillness, a mindfulness, or practice, or a prayer, or kind of an intentional stillness that you have. Something you do every day, something that allows you to filter out the noise, to connect with whatever it is that's most essential for you, right? So practice is the first thing. The second thing is you need a crucible, you need a holding space, you need a small group of people where you can listen to each other with unconditional, with an open mind and with an open heart, right? So with an unconditional commitment to really support the other person, to not judge, no cynicism, but really trying to be in support of the other person. Now, for some of us, we have that relationship with one other person. Maybe we call it coach, or maybe we call it friend. But what we know is there's this whole movement in the world that's called circle work. So we developed our own practice around that. So why is it that in ULab, 30% in the exit survey, people say it was life-changing for me? Why? Well, not because they saw some interesting or mind-blowing videos. No, nothing happens through videos. It happened through their coaching circles, where we developed, that's one of the tools, the awareness-based social technology tools. You go in 60 minutes through a 7-step process, right? Where you basically share your situation, your own edge, kind of where you're kind of at a, your own learning edge. And then the others in the group, rather than judging you or giving you great recommendations or stuff, they just mirror back images, feelings, and gestures. And from there, you move into a deep transformative conversation. So it's a deep mirroring process. And if you do that in a group, it can be absolutely transformative. That's why, so that's the second condition. It's a small group, where you create a situation where two things apply. One is courage, kind of you really open up. So in order to open up, in order to share to you my real learning edge, I basically need to open up where I experience the letting go of the old and letting come of the new. So that's kind of one. I need to show my own vulnerability there. And the other condition is listening with your mind and heart wide open. And not giving advice, but just mirroring back. And that creates somehow an alchemy, right? So these two conditions where, you have a conversation that turns into a source of, into a regenerative source, and a source of kind of that generates not only new ideas, but new energy, kind of an increased way of accessing my own best self. Because my own best self is already there. It's just dormant, right? But how can I access that? So that's the second condition. It's kind of the circle there. And the third one is, I would say, it's basically finding, you all know that, right? So as social entrepreneurs, it's like, do your own thing, right? Tap into your highest purpose. Tap into what you're put on earth here to do, to make happen. Kind of this, do what you love what you do, kind of this connecting with your deeper life's intention. I think that's the third leverage point. So those are the three things: practice, the deep coaching, the deep circle work, with 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually it's not more than 5 or 6 people. And the third one is basically do your own thing. Tap the power of intention, kind of connect to your real life's purpose, and create a support structure around that. Because the reality is, yes, the way I articulated that last decade is slightly different to what I need to do today. So this is it's not like, oh, I figured that out years ago and now I'm just on autopilot. No, I need to attend to that. I need to attend to that every day. And I think those are the leverage points that one way or another, not only help you to hold the space for mindset shift, but also connect to the deeper sources that are really critical today. Because I believe we are really, on a planetary level, with all the environmental issues, all the societies breaking apart, and then this whole kind of technology thing coming upon us, really turning us into extensions of algorithms and machines. We are really in an interesting situation where anything can happen, and I think where it is our job really kind of to put in place like infrastructures that allows the next generation of change makers to really activate more of the potential that's already there today. I feel there's an amazing potential there, but also an amazing amount of noise. So putting our attention on where the possibility is, I think that's why you need the morning practice, kind of to attune yourself into that. And that's why we need to connect with each other in order to make that happen also on a collective level.
Thank you, Otto. I am conscious of the time. We're coming to a close. We have 2 more comments, and if you can comment on it, it would be great. One is, how do you apply this when one is embedded in a space and situation of violence? And the second question is, how is Presencing Institute, what's Presencing Institute relationship to the youth year, growing up years programs in Ashoka? But that probably somebody else could answer too. So, but if you can talk about the embedded in violence, what do we do there?
Can you ask the question again, the first one?
Sure. So the entire comment is, I see this happening in these intentional spaces. I wonder if you could share any reflections on how to apply this when embedded in a space and situation of violence.
Okay. Well, there's, I think of, in terms of violence, I think there are like three major types of violence going on right now. It's direct violence, right? So as we all know, then there's structural violence, which is we have victims, but no individual perpetrators, right? Like poverty, and so economic issues, inequality. So those are examples of structural violence. And then I think there's also something that could be called attentional violence. And attentional violence is basically not seeing the other person in terms of who she really is. So it's basically, our blind spot. Conceiving of others maybe not in terms of their highest future potential. And I think that's the attentional violence is interesting because I think it's in many ways the roots also for structural violence, and it's something we can do something about every single day. So I would say in general, what you do, like the process that I described, going to the edges of the system, right, and attending to all these different perspectives with your mind and heart wide open. So these are instructions that basically, so going to the edges of the system means looking at the system from the viewpoint of the people that are at the receiving ends of structural violence, right? That's what it means. And then attending with your mind and heart wide open, it means like stop enacting attentional violence, right? But really kind of open your eyes, open your heart, and kind of really connect to all these different perspectives. So I would say, in principle, what you do with the U process is you try to you try to bring the institutionalized structural and attentional violence that is operating in the system to not only each individual's attention, but also to the collective attention when you contemplate, all right, what did we learn? And so the 3D, the 4D, why do you do the 4D? Because it creates like an embodied collective experience where you can no longer be in denial of the mechanisms of attentional and structural violence. So that's why you do that, and that's why where the value of that is. Now, obviously, if you have like a high conflict situation, it is not always possible. We know that kind of from conflict resolution work and peace work. You can't just bring everyone together in the room. It's not working that way, right? It's exploding. It's too explosive. So what you need to do in these cases is you start much smaller. You need to build the container, right? And that often is one-on-one or small groups, first with this group, this group, this group. You build the trust there, and it's kind of, so it's like you need to cultivate the soil before you bring the entire system together. That can take many times, but it's very important work, because without that, so usually, so the critical point is always the container condition. Can you build the holding space? And when I talk with one other person one-on-one, that's much more easy than when I bring everyone together who have like lots of history of violence and so on. It's very hard to do that. So that's usually the last thing. So the more violence, trauma, structural violence you have, the more you need to attend to the holding space, the healing condition. What is healing? Healing means making whole. That's also what health means. So you need to create these conditions in small microcosms first, and then from there, you can move to bring people together in a microcosm that holds the complexity of the whole. So it's an iterative process. But the leverage point is really the going in with the right intention, being very transparent around that, and creating holding spaces that allows, you know, this opening up to happen, and then to take one step after another.
Great, thank you. We are on time. Thank you, Otto, for everything, for the sharing the insights, and for all of the community to participate. We have recorded this conversation, and we will share it internally for any reference. And what I would like to share is that if anyone is interested in learning more about it, just come to Learning and Development to me, because we have really great partnership with Presencing Institute, and we will be able to offer some support to people to participate in the capacity building programs. Thank you, Otto. And everyone can just unmute and say goodbye if you like.
Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Otto.
Well done. Thanks a lot, Otto. That was amazing.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was amazing.